Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Neville and I'm from Nebraska, and my extraordinary Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015 when I was only 18 years old at the time. I would really appreciate greatly remaining anonymous for the purposes of my story if you don't mind. I live on a large 110-acre plot of land that has been passed down our family tree for many generations since beyond the 1800s, so to speak. I live with both my amazing parents on a ranch-style property that is nestled on a discreet country road surrounded by stunning landscaping and a beautiful paved circular driveway. Our home is quite literally flanked on every side with woods that consist of oaks, horse chestnut, walnut and pines, along with lovely open pastures, as well as a couple of very large ponds and an Olympic-sized swimming pool, well, almost Olympic-sized. Our distinguished home is made out of bricks and mortar and is painted in a soft pale cream colour, which is accented by exquisite stone marble work on our pillars and steps throughout. We also have the ubiquitous amount of charming large wooden panelled windows that secure ample light into our home, as well as serving us with fabulously picturesque lush views over our yard, pasture, pond and trees. My father has always been incredibly prolific about growing trees in Nebraska, and much like his grandfather before him, and so our woods are a thriving haven of indigenous species all over our land. One of my favourite go-to spots on our wraparound wooden deck, which has proven to be an invaluable and wonderful family retreat, where we can literally watch the deer congregating for a quick drink at our pond, while relaxing and luxuriating on our long sun loungers, drinking margaritas and enjoying the golden tangerine sunset over the horizon. It really doesn't get better than that, I assure you. I consider myself remarkably privileged and very, very lucky to have grown up in such a quintessential, beautiful abode with two such easygoing, loving parents and a really amazing young brother called Wayne, who is absolutely my best friend. Since we were knee-high to a grasshopper, we have pretty much remained inseparable. Growing up, Wayne and I did everything together, and although we have always enjoyed the benefits of technology, we truly are naturally the outdoorsy, al fresco, nature-loving types. And unlike many kids of our own age, growing up, we never obsessed over mobile phones or technology, and we still don't. I promise you, more often than not, we will actually leave our mobile phones on voicemail most of the day and go off exploring together. My father taught us that we should never become joined at the hip by technology, and especially not by our cell phones, because he describes them as the biggest time suckers and leeches imaginable. I only tend to use my phone in the evenings, where I love accessing YouTube videos. Beyond that, I pretty much stay clear from technology and subsequently get a lot more done during the day as a result. My brother and I started hunting with my father when we were as young as 11 years old, and as a result we spent copious amount of time outdoors and are also passionate hunters. We have hunted all kinds of animals in Nebraska, from white-tailed deer, mule, elk, and bighorn sheep. We love spending our spare time in the woods, but I do promise you this, there are so many inscrutable things that go on in the woods around the world that are seemingly undecipherable and supernaturally mysterious. Our woods are no exception to that rule. My brother and I have had our fair share of strange, baffling, somewhat bizarre, anomalous experiences, let me tell you. One day when my brother and I were very young, I think I was about 12 and my brother 11, we were sitting on our wooden deck at about 12 o'clock on a Saturday night. My parents had long since gone to bed, but we heard this horrible spectral-like wailing sound coming from the woods, and it was so eerily sinister that it sent horrifying shivers of foreboding trepidation down our spines. My brother was exceedingly reluctant to go out into the woods to investigate, because the noise had scared him half to death, and his eyes were quite literally as round as saucers, and he was physically shaking. I selfishly urged him to come with me into the woods with me, because in truth I was utterly terrified to go out on my own. I was torn between this insidious fear and this desperate, desirous urge to find out what indeed was actually going on in there. I was also predisposed to being far too inquisitive for my own good. I remember that night so very clearly because the energy in those woods was divergent and had taken on an incredibly menacing, inharmonious, almost evil ambience, and I was quite astounded to discover that the chorus of crickets, croaking frogs, and animal calls had all but dissipated, and it was so quiet that you could quite literally have heard your own breathing before your face. "Please let's go back," my frenzied brother was urging me frantically. "Something feels very wrong in here." He was right, of course, but I was not going to agree with him, because my curiosity was ruling my common sense, so I told him to stop being such a flake, and so begrudgingly he followed me deeper into the woods, and that was when we saw it. My brother and I just froze in utter incredulity because we saw what appeared to be an intelligent spiral of thick white smoke in the air that was twisting, winding, turning, and creating all kinds of weird, very peculiar shapes within the vapour. Suddenly within the smoke we saw this very clear vision of a huge, hideously ugly, contorted face that was staring at us through this mist. The only way that I can describe it is like the images that you sometimes actually see in the clouds. But the only differentiation was that this face was very real, with teacup-sized, luminescent green predatory eyes staring at us with a hungry intent. I really got the impression that this thing wanted our very soul. The funny thing was that try as we might to escape, my brother and I could literally not run away, because physically this smoky vapour appeared to somehow impair us, seemingly disabling us from being able to move. It was like we were being held down by an unseen, invisible force in a standing position, and this force was incredibly powerful. It was the most terrifying experience that I have ever encountered in my entire life, and I felt like a frozen statue that simply was incapacitated and could not move. Suddenly the smoky face opened its mouth to release a huge, harrowing, gut-wrenching wail, and then it released its hold on us, and it just spiraled away like a smoke from a chimney. As you can imagine, my brother and I were absolutely petrified, and we hightailed it out of the woods as fast as we possibly could, and it literally took us weeks before we ventured into the woods again. We never ever told our parents what we'd seen that night, because we couldn't even discern it ourselves, so what was the point? To this day, we still will say, what the heck was that thing we saw all those years ago? And to date, I have absolutely no answer to that baffling, curious question, and I probably never ever will. But I hope with all my heart I never encounter that insidious evil ever again. 1 week before my 18th birthday, my brother and I were hanging out in the woods to escape the heat of a sweltering hot summer's day, as the woods always provide us with some shady relief, and believe me, it can get hot in Nebraska. Suddenly we heard these tiny little cries that sounded exactly like little kittens in anguished distress. My brother and I looked for the source of these cries, but we found absolutely nothing. We decided to turn in for the day, when I discovered the most horrifying sight. We uncovered the dead body of a magnificent mountain lion in the prime of her young life, lying on the forest floor with all this green stuff coming out of her mouth. She was very definitely deceased. There was no evidence that the body had actually been mauled, harmed, or attacked by a violent predator, but we could only assume that she had succumbed to some kind of dreadful poisoning. These creatures are so elusive, and yet there she was, lying before us as clear as day, her body still warm to the touch, and I could see that her breast area was very enlarged, and I knew immediately that we had discovered a nursing mother, whose little cubs lay forsaken and abandoned somewhere. My brother and I tried to search desperately for the deserted little cubs, but despite this fact, we heard their frantic calls. They somehow managed to elude us. We were pretty certain that those cubs were going to be eaten by predators, and it seemed so unbearably sad. But we knew that nature could be brutally cruel and savagely cutthroat, seemingly only pertaining to the survival of the fittest, as is usually always the way. It must have been about a whole week later. It was on the day of my 18th birthday, to be precise. My brother and I decided to go into the woods for a morning hike, because we always relished taking leisurely strolls in the woods, as we savoured in the tranquil, soothing serenity that we encountered there. On this particular occasion we had been walking for a long while, when we suddenly heard the familiar sound of a baby kitten crying, and my brother and I looked at each other agog. We were both thinking the same thing at the same time. It sounded like the calls that we had heard on the day that we found that dead mountain lion in the woods. Surely it was not possible for those little critters to have survived an entire week without suckling their mother's breast. My brother and I walked very quietly towards the source of the calls, moving furtively behind a large tree. Suddenly we saw her, and we could not believe what we were actually seeing. Could this really be true? I'm ashamed to say that my brother and I grew up as highly cynical, very sceptical, and exceptionally dismissive of the creature known as Bigfoot. We believed anyone who considered him to be remotely true was barking mad or completely cuckoo. So it was like being splashed with ice-cold water to see this curious creature sitting there larger than life before us, and a huge wake-up call for us. Yes, you've guessed it. We were staring at an awesome Bigfoot. I have heard people describe Bigfoots as ugly, hideous and grotesque before, but this magnificent creature was anything but, and the energy she exuded was gentle and loving. She was covered in gloriously soft, flowing golden hair, and had the most exquisite honey-brown eyes that were set in a long angular face. Her head was a cone shape that blended seamlessly onto a pair of very large shoulders. I did not know how tall she was, but sitting down, her torso appeared to be about 4.5 feet off the ground, so if she was standing up, she would have been a towering colossal giant, that was for sure. I noticed her sinewy muscles were very dense and ripped, and her upper body was about 4 foot wide. What we saw next was the rarest, unprecedented, gregarious thing that I've ever seen in my entire life. This very unselfish Bigfoot was a mother with a child all of her own, but she was nursing 2 mountain lion cubs, as if they were her very own, along with her own youngling. You would have easily perceived that Bigfoots and mountain lions were sworn enemies, so seeing such a curious anomaly was an outstanding miracle of nature, if ever I saw one. I could see by her expression that she was deliriously happy and full of immense joy, more than I have ever witnessed in an animal before. I could feel tears of awe welling up in my own eyes, and believe me, I never cry. But I was observing nature at her most generous, most bountiful and unselfish. The Bigfoot looked up in our direction to where I was standing, and I realized she knew my brother and I were watching her. So my head peered at her from behind the tree, and suddenly our eyes locked. In that moment there was a soulful connection between the two of us that touched the very depths of my soul. It was such a beautiful union of thought in that second that literally transformed my life in a vital moment. This dutiful mother continued to nurse the cubs while my brother and I watched in utter awe. We studied her for a long while, and she was not bothered by our attention or our presence. On the contrary, she embraced us happily, like a spirited, prideful mother showing off her kids to admiring onlookers, and she looked at us with such a pleased, proud look on her face. It was like she really embraced motherhood with an exuberant, contented passion that could not be curtailed. When we told my mother about the phenomenal Bigfoot nursing those mountain lions in our woods, my mother believed us immediately, because she knew as children we were not predisposed to telling lies or making up spurious tales. My mother loves fussing over everything and everyone, so she bustled around the kitchen gathering all kinds of things together, like fruit such as peaches, grapes, potato chips and other snacks, and told me to take them immediately to the woods where we had actually seen the Bigfoot's nursing. She insisted to us that nursing mothers need lots and lots of energy, and emphasized this mother Bigfoot had 3 mouths to feed now and was reassuming another mother's responsibility, and so we would help her as much as we possibly could. So for about 6 months or so, we left the Bigfoot all kinds of edibles, and we discovered that she had a particular love of grapes, peaches and bananas, bacon and ham. We would leave the food for her in the forest because my mother insisted we must give her as much space as we possibly could, and we did that. So we actually did not get to see her for quite a long while, which really was rather sad. A year later, my mother and I witnessed the female Bigfoot on our lands with a mountain lion killing a 5-year-old male white-tailed deer, and they engaged in this hunt together like a formidable, inspiring, well-organised coalition. It was utterly extraordinary to watch, and even my mother, who saw her, was blown away by her beauty, magnificence, majesty, grace and elegance. She told me that she believed the mountain lion deemed that it was also a Bigfoot, as it was raised by such an outstanding, incredible mother. It appeared to have an awesome bond and a close affiliation with his adoptive mother that had not been broken off by the cords of age, sex, or even species. Over the years, I have had numerous sightings of Mother Bigfoot and her sprog, whom is now a fully grown elephantine-sized Bigfoot male, accompanied by 2 healthy-looking mountain lions that are thriving on our land together, managing the exponential flourishing deer population. They have never been a problem, but truly are a bountiful blessing to our lives. We do sometimes leave Mother Bigfoot, who we now call Bertha, a selection of delicious fruit to enjoy, and she has gifted us with feathers, antlers, deerskins and pebbles that she leaves at our door. My mother and father are utterly protective over Bertha, so much so, in fact, that they've refused to almost let me share my story with you and your listeners without remaining anonymous for Bertha's protection, because we love her that much, almost as a family member, along with her 2 mountain lions that are also exceptionally discerning creatures, all thanks to being raised by a highly intelligent, discriminating, perceptive and judicious Bigfoot. My heart really does go out to people out there who've had challenging and terrifying encounters with Bigfoot, because I do believe, like humans, there are many different Bigfoot species out there, and some of them are possibly hateful, violent and aggressive, and I imagine could be potentially very dangerous to people and even scare them away from their homes for good. Let's not kid. I promise you these animals are powerful and strong and could easily lift a car without even breaking a sweat. I would say Bertha's little one is now 8 foot tall and 700 pounds, so he's a hefty specimen, I promise you. We never got to see Bertha's own partner, but I have this gut feeling that he is now deceased. I don't know what happened to him. If Bertha was aggressive and violent, I assure you she would be highly dangerous and tear you limb from limb in a heartbeat if she wanted to. But Bertha is an exceptional Bigfoot with a heart of absolute gold, and I've noticed she is ethical in her hunting practices as well, and tends to only kill 5-year-old male deer, and is insightful and fully selective about every one of her kills, and has even taught her mountain lions to be as discerning and as sapient. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I'm so delighted that a couple of truckers have finally come forward with their fascinating encounters while driving along our North American highways. And so although I've kept my strange encounters secret for so long, I've decided to share them with you and your audience, who I'm delighted to see appear to have such open minds. Before I became a trucker, I was such a contemptuous, derisive person, a hardened cynic that quite literally had no belief in things that I could not physically see or explain. But boy, did that change after trucking for a few long years. I now know emphatically that there are things out there going on, most commonly in the dark shadows of the night, that truly defy natural explanation. How do I know this? Because I've experienced them for myself, and there is nothing like a one-on-one encounter with the supernatural to make the hardened skeptic in you metamorphosize into a believer. What about the spurious, fictitious Bigfoot accounts? Are they real too, you may wonder? And I I will use this platform to tell you emphatically as a trucker that I have seen him on more than one occasion, and yes, Bigfoot is very definitely real. This elusive creature that many doubt exists is indeed roaming our forests in North America, and I can assure you of that because I've seen him myself. Before I became a trucker, the very idea of Bigfoot existing would have left me hooting with laughter, as I would find such a bizarre suggestion hilariously funny. I'm shamefully penitent to admit this to you and your listeners, but now I reluctantly look back at the old me and realize how pompous, haughty and arrogant I was to so righteously assume I knew absolutely everything about absolutely nothing. Looking back, I realize how naive, benighted and ignorant I truly was. My name is Tyler, and I grew up in Atlanta in the early 80s with my brother Jordan and my sister Elise, in a very dysfunctional, maladjusted home with a very formidable father whom we feared greatly. He was the headmaster of a local school and governed the school with a rod of iron, much like he dominated his own home, and he always treated us children as if we were more like students than his own kids, so there was no love lost between any of us. He earned the formidable, unflattering nickname Mr. Bluebottom, because in those days he was not afraid to lash you hard with a leather belt, and it would hurt so bad it was almost impossible not to cry out in anguish and pain. I remember you were literally disabled from sitting on your derriere for a couple of days after one of his hectic beatings, because your wallet bottom would quite literally turn an ominous shade of blue from the bruising. Many parents admired how my father, Mr. Bluebottom, towed everyone into line, but he used fear as a powerful crushing weapon to subdue and control, as well as suppress and curb our naturally mischievous and adventurous spirits that are so typical of young boys. At home it was 1,000 times worse, believe me, than at school, and even my mother was so terrified of our dad, and before he even returned home she'd be working herself up into a huge frenzied lather because she was possibly more terrified of seeing him than we actually were. When my father was at home, no one ever spoke a word, and our home was filled with the ominous sound of reticent silence. At dinner all you could hear was the sound of cutlery on our plates, as we tucked into our meal around the formal dinner table without ever saying a word, and it would have seemed that my father approved of this stoic, unnatural silence, and if anyone dared to speak a word, they were severely reprimanded. He would say, "It is better for children to be seen and not heard, so eat up and shut up if you know what's good for you." So in truth, every mealtime became a living hell, because the silence was absolutely deafening, and would leave me languishing with feelings of great apprehension and dread. One day my mother surprised us all by throwing her dinner plate across the table, and we watched in absolute horror as the china plate smashed, breaking into thousands of pieces, and we saw spaghetti, tomato sauce and mince fly all over the table and dribble down the walls in a sorrowful, bloody-looking mess that was symbolic of the messed-up state of our lives at the time. "I've had about as much as I can take of this torturous dolor existence," she screamed. "I'm sick and tired of being Miss Perfect, and I cannot take it any more. It's all so fake. Come, Elise," she said to my sister, "we're going now." I was very impressed by my mother's courageous outburst, because she was normally as quiet as a church mouse, but I think that deep down she was like a pressure cooker waiting to explode, and when she did finally erupt, there was no going back for her. We all sat at the dinner table absolutely terrified, too silent and afraid to intervene or say anything for fear of experiencing the wrathful indignation and brutal chastisement from my dad. I watched my mother and my sister put on their coats and grab a suitcase, and they climbed into my mother's Dodger car. I heard the car doors slamming behind them, the engine purring, and then they were gone. And when I say gone, I literally mean gone forever from our lives. That was the last time I saw my mother and sister for many long years, and I really resented the fact that she left us boys to be raised by our obnoxious father all on our own. It took me a long time to forgive my mother for that, as it was like she was leaving 2 goldfish with a piranha, and that wasn't nice. I remember that night with such crystal clear clarity. My father turned around and looked at both of us and said, "I guess it's just the 3 of us now. If your mother thinks I'm going to take her back after such a horrendous effusive outburst, she can think again. Now get all this mess cleaned up at once and go to bed. It looks like an animal's been slaughtered in here." I was amazed that my father displayed absolutely no emotion, nor even sadness about what had just transpired with my mother and her grievous outburst. But he never ever knew how to express love. All these years later, I emphatically believe that my father was a self-effacing narcissist. In fact, I'm almost sure of it. After several years of being beaten black and blue by our dad and being bullied, belittled, humiliated and reprimanded day after day and night after night, you can see why I was eager to become a truck driver. My father was bullying and coercing me to take a law degree, but I wanted to get out of his parental clutches as soon as I possibly could, and quite literally I saw trucking as my physical and emotional salvation, and believe me, it was. As soon as I was old enough, I was driving a long-haul truck on those North American highways, and for the first time in my life I did feel gloriously unconfined and free. Most truck drivers find the hardest part of the job being away from home, but for me, being away from home was the most liberating thing about the job. I did, of course, miss my younger brother, who had to put up with my dad for another year or so until he could finally break free from my father's shackles. I was much younger than all the other truckers driving at the time, but as the need for truck drivers was so critical, thankfully my age was overlooked. I was competent and efficient and met all my delivery windows, and so after a while my employers became confident in hiring my services, and I acquired a definitive reputation. Driving during the daytime did have its distinct disadvantages for me, because I would get frustrated with checkpoints and hold-ups on the road that could sometimes wreak havoc by hindering time schedules quite significantly and cause major setbacks. The first thing I noticed when I began to drive my truck is just how astronomically gigantesque and magnificent North America actually is, and I was also astonished by the never-ending, immeasurable space of our great and wonderful, marvellous land. I must admit some of the areas I drove through were so exquisitely beautiful. It was difficult not to take off some personal time to go exploring, but that was unfortunately not conceivably possible. I would drive through a kaleidoscope of different scenery, from glorious emerald green rolling hills, snow-capped mountains, pastures dotted with grazing horses and cows, pretty little barns, rustic-looking homes, silvery lakes, pretty ponds, ubiquitous areas of forest, not forgetting some of those idyllic rural towns. It was all incredibly picturesque and absolutely charming. One day I decided to start driving at night, and just for a change, and also because I thought it would be interesting, exhilarating experience, and believe me, it really was. There were significant disadvantages, of course, to driving at night, but the huge benefits in terms of the excessive traffic congestion far outweighed the negative effects. One evening I was driving down the road and came upon a hit-and-run accident. I say that because there was a woman lying in the middle of the road, bleeding out furiously, and it looked like someone had driven over her legs as they had been severed from her body and were lying yards away from her torso. It was the most horrific sight I've ever seen. It seemed incredulous to me that she was still actually alive. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, and in that moment I wasn't sure quite how to react, because I was so shocked by this frightfully macabre and gruesome sight. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and I could see the woman looking up at me in the truck with these anguished, disheartened eyes that appeared to be begging me to help her. I immediately called 911, although I knew it was far too late for this woman, and she probably had only moments left to live, but I knew that I didn't want her to die all alone without making an effort to finally comfort her. What on earth was I going to say to someone who had seconds left to live, I wondered in horror. I was not good at consoling people at the very best of times. Maybe she had a message she wanted me to convey to a loved one, I thought. I climbed out of my truck hastily and ran towards the middle of the road, but the woman was not there. The tarmac of the highway was undisturbed, still warm from the day, and very smooth, and there was absolutely no evidence of blood-staining anywhere. Was I going stark raving mad, I wondered to myself. I was beginning to wonder about my own mental faculties. Maybe I was overtired, too exhausted. Had I been driving too long? Was I now hallucinating? Yet I know what I saw, and the picture was embedded in my mind like a graving on a tombstone. You don't just imagine things like that, with such vivid recall. It was not even conceivably possible. My imagination wasn't even that good. I was certain I'd seen a woman lying in the middle of the road, dying after a hit-and-run accident, and now I was beginning to ambiguously doubt what I'd actually seen. When the emergency services did arrive, I explained to them what I'd seen and apologised profusely that I must have been seeing things, because what I'd seen had been so vivid and so clear to me. One of the EMTs asked me to report what I'd seen to her, and she went as white as a sheet when I recalled what I believed I'd just witnessed on the road. I watched the colour literally drain from her face in horror. Her eyes grew as round as saucers, and her chin hung in an open, fixed gasp. What you saw was very real and incredibly accurate, she reassured me. I was here when I attended to a woman a year ago. She was lying in the middle of the road, having been mown down by a hit-and-run driver on the spot of the highway a year earlier, exactly as you described. The woman you recounted fits her description so perfectly, down to the very last detail. Her legs were indeed severed in the way you describe, and she bled out and was dead before we were able to attend to her medically. Now I was the one that was shaking. Well, what the heck did I see then? I asked the EMT. The EMT tried to calm me down. I don't know how to say this to you, but I think you actually saw her ghost, she told me. But don't feel bad about calling us out like this. It's not the first time something weird and as crazy as this has happened to us. I assure you it's not as uncommon as you might actually think. I remember getting back into my truck and shaking violently as I watched the ambulance service leave. I was trembling as I put the key into the ignition again. And then, I couldn't believe it, I saw the ghost of the pleading, desperate, dying woman all over again. Please, no, I begged. No, not again. This is just too much. This is more than I can handle. I could not drive through the ghost again, that looked so real, so I climbed out of the truck to inspect the road, but there was nothing there. I really felt like I was going on bonkers, but I know what I saw. The road was still warm to the touch, but there was no sign of blood anywhere. I really was losing it, I thought. The ghost had appeared hauntingly real. Feeling foolish, I got back into the truck, closed my eyes for a few more seconds to avoid seeing the frantic eyes of the ghostly apparition again, and then I hightailed it down that piece of highway as fast as I possibly could. It was a very creepy, insidious feeling that did not leave me for a very long time. It still makes me feel nauseous and queasy when I visit that memory again, as it is a night I cannot forget in a hurry. One night I was driving down the highway, and I very nearly, narrowly missed running over a seemingly beautiful woman that was wearing a very expensive, glamorous fox fur coat, and had suddenly just waddled into the road with a purposeful intent, oblivious to the impending danger of my truck. I remember saying, "What the heck, woman? Why don't you look where you're going? I nearly ran you over." I immediately braked and climbed out of my truck just to check if the woman had recovered from the stunned shock of being nearly run over by my truck. What was she doing in the middle of the highway, wandering around at this time of the night, I wondered. All kinds of horrifying thoughts went rushing through my head, like, was she escaping from a dangerous man or something like that? Could she be possibly in need of my help? I was not prepared for what I was about to see. As you can imagine, it was the 80s, and I was not sure what on earth this extraordinary, peculiar creature actually was. My first thought was, what the heck is this? I had initially thought the 4-foot person was a stunningly beautiful woman wearing a luxurious, glamorous fox fur. But the red fox coat was not a fur coat at all, but a creature that was covered from head to toe in long, luxurious red hair. What on earth was this exceptional creature, I wondered over and over again to myself. I'd never seen anything remotely like it before. It looked like a cross between a human and an ape. I know of no other way to describe it to you. It was standing at the edge of the highway, looking frightened and with very large, big golden brown eyes that seemed dazed, disorientated, and very shocked. The poor creature was trembling with fear because it was so human-like. It was the most natural thing for me to do to comfort it. I think it knew that it had narrowly missed being killed by my truck. "I'm so sorry," I said. "Are you all right?" I reached out to touch one of the hairy arms, and the creature seemed to be momently comforted by my touch. I continued to stroke the creature's arm reassuringly, not knowing what else to do, and it started to make these strange whimpering sounds that sounded really remarkably like a distraught dog. The irony is that the creature even smelt like a dog. It smelt like a wet dog, so to speak. Suddenly gliding across the road towards us were two gargantuan forms, the likes of such I've never seen before, and judging by the severe look on their hairless leather faces, they were far from happy, but their irate, frenetic anger was not directed towards me, but to the creature I narrowly missed running over. I realized almost immediately that the little creature was their beloved Sprog, and like any concerned parent, they were happy and fraught all at the same time to be reunited with their little one. For a while I could hear the mother chattering away to her young one in what appeared to be an angry gibberish. The little Sprog looked up at its mother with big wide open eyes and made a whimpering sound which clearly had the effect of pulling at her heartstrings, as she immediately stopped chattering and then ruffled his golden hair on his cone-shaped head as if to say, "It's all forgiven and forgotten, but don't you dare do that again to me." All the while the large male creature, who was clearly the father, never said a single word, but he went over to his youngling and also ruffled the hair on its head affectionately, which I realized must be an expression of love. Then the male stood before me and looked at me very intently with his deep-set golden-brown eyes that seemed to express extreme gratitude. He was literally standing only a foot away from me, so uncomfortably close, in fact, that I could see inside his flat nose the pink nostrils, and when he breathed, he sounded exactly like a horse. I should have been absolutely terrified, because he was so imposing and majestic and lofty, and was about 10 foot tall, 1,000 pounds, and 5 foot wide. It was like I was standing a foot away from King Kong himself, and I was trembling in my boots. Imagine my amazement when this colossal male put his gargantuan hand and sausage-like fingers on my shoulders and tapped me a couple of times with his overlong hairy hands, in what I believe was an expression of appreciation and extreme gratitude. Then he moved away from me, and I watched these two colossal ape-like humanoids that I now know to be Bigfoots glide seamlessly across the road, with the little one sitting on the father's shoulders looking very happy. I watched them take huge strides over the guardrail, down the embankment, into the woods beyond. They were magnificent to watch, and as they moved their graceful bodies, they almost floated with a seamless grace. It took me years to get over that gratifying, effable experience, which was so magnificent, beautiful, shocking, and hair-raising, all at the very same time, because I had no idea what I'd encountered that day, until many, many long years later, when the subject of Bigfoot was more openly discussed. On another occasion I was driving my truck through the horrendous rainstorm, and believe me, it was literally bucketing down with rain, and the area had become cloaked in a murky, insidious darkness, and you could hear the ominous rumbles of thunder in the distance, and detect a fleeting flash of golden light across the sky, which was, of course, the lightning. I noticed a young boy wearing a bright yellow raincoat with a large hoodie covering his face. He was standing at the side of the road, getting completely soaked and drenched, and waving me down. It was only about 5 in the afternoon at the time, and as it was a rural area, I imagined the boy lived close by. I pulled up my truck over to the side of the road to take a reprieve from this chaotic storm, because I'm not keen at driving in when it's chucking down like this, and on this occasion I thought I'd let the poor drenched kid dry off in my car until the rain did finally recede, as that was the courteous thing to do in this situation. I pulled over to the side of the road and opened the truck door and called out to the boy. "Boy, you can sit in my truck until the rain stops chucking down," I said. The boy got obediently into my truck, and he sat next to me on the opposite seat. He never looked at me once, nor did he acknowledge me, which was decidedly odd. For some reason I could feel chills going up my spine, and my hair was standing on edge, and I became freezing cold. I could sense something was intrinsically wrong, and I was literally begging God inside to make the rain stop so I could get rid of this boy as quickly as I possibly could. The strange boyish form in the yellow raincoat appeared so non-responsive as he sat there, it was giving me the creeps. "Where are you from?" I said, trying to make polite, friendly conversation, and the boy did not answer. I could not see his face clearly because he was staring through the windscreen into the rainstorm, and his face was buried beneath the yellow hoodie. He never said a single word. The spooky, creepy energy he exuded was not like that of a child, but very menacing, duplicitous, and evil. I know of no other way to describe it. Suddenly the boy turned around and looked at me with a huge, ghoulish grin, and he had empty, dark, gnarled hollows where his eldritch eyes should have been. I remember screaming and telling him to get out of my truck. "Get out now!" I screamed. "Get out! Get out!" Suddenly he was gone in a flash of light, and the seat where he'd been sitting was not even remotely wet. Now you explain how that's possible. That gave me the creeps. I looked around for the obnoxious, deranged, devilish boy, but he had gone, seemingly vanished into thin air, and I promise you that nefarious, maniacal experience freaked me out, and I believe that the entity in my truck was not that of a boy at all, but of something diabolically fiendish and demonic that was so terrifying I drove home to my destination, shaking and trembling the entire way. I do not recall a time that I was ever more afraid, because my encounter with that prodigious, grotesque boy was like meeting the devil face to face. So there you are, that's my story, which I hope was of interest to your listeners. You'll be glad to know that my brother became a long-haul trucker a year after I did, and he's got some exciting stories to share with you. He luckily escaped our father's brutal clutches as well. I was finally reunited with my mother and sister about 15 years later, and she was no longer the mousy, self-effacing, diffident person I'd once known growing up. It was a very happy reunion, and we became a very close family again, and thankfully we never saw my father, and so I'm clueless about what actually happened to him, and frankly, as heartless and cold as this may sound, I really don't care a jot. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Oliver, and my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in the Pacific Northwest when I was a young boy of 11 years old in 1983. I lived in a quintessential rustic rural neighbourhood where all the houses were uniquely individual and all painted in pretty bright colours, so reminiscent of the 80s period. Our sunflower yellow house was known as the doll's house in our street because of its perfect box-like symmetry, angular coal-black roof, and pretty white wooden framed French windows. All the houses on our streets had their own front and back yards that overlooked very pretty green rolling hills, valleys, and mountainous outcrops. On the right-hand side of our street was an area of natural, gorgeous emerald green forest that literally stretched back for hundreds upon hundreds of miles. You'd be forgiven for assuming that there was a secret gardening competition going on in the street among the locals, but of course no one ever said such a thing. But you could clearly see the neighbours were all trying to outsmart and outdo each other with better floral displays in their front yards than the next person. And even at 11 years old, these subtle adult contentions were all so clearly apparent to me. At number 20, Mrs. Payne, for example, would plant a beautiful display of pretty white flowers against one of her walls, and the following day, I kid you not, Mr. Piper at number 22 had bought an even more superior selection of white flowers and had added an extra addition of white pebbles and pretty white trellising, creating a much more dazzling effect that quite literally made Mrs. Payne's previously very attractive floral display look almost paltry and pathetic by contrast. He might as well have written in bright blazing smug crimson paint across the walls that mine is better than yours. It was an ongoing, invisible, contentious competition between neighbours that was relentless over the spring and summer months. Why could they not be simpler like kids and have straightforward competition together? What was all this secrecy, pomposity and smugness of eclipsing your neighbour all about? I would wonder. Why did adults have to be so peculiarly complicated? Did it really matter at the end of the day whose floral display was best this summer? As a young boy growing up, my main objective was to have a whole lot of fun, and as the only son of two parents, I spent most of my time with two other children in our neighbourhood of similar age to myself, Colin, who was 11, and Eloise, who was 12. We would spend ages playing all kinds of exciting games together, and what I loved about Eloise was she was no different to any other boy, and loved roughing it and getting dirty with all our boyish games and pranks. We would swim in the pool in our backyards, ride our bikes around the neighbourhood, climb trees and play soccer. It was all incredibly fun. As is the case with any small town where gossip is rife and commonplace and word travels far and wide, there is not much you can do without one of your neighbours finding out about it very soon. Our street was not short of its eccentric characters, and we so happened to have one of those oddballs living right next door to us, and her name was Dorothy Dickens. We used to call her Ditsy Dot, because her vacuous head was all over the place, and she was sometimes almost appeared quite harebrained, imprudent, and exceedingly scatty. I remember one birthday she made me a girl's bright pink Barbie doll cake, which was supposed to be flavoured with cinnamon, but in her flighty, frivolous attempts to bake, she accidentally incorporated copious amounts of jalapeno pepper spice into the cake instead. Ditsy Dot was a diabetic and could not taste her own creations, so she was obliviously unaware of how dreadful her cake actually tasted. My mother literally forced me to pretend to enjoy a piece of her cake with a huge smile on my face, while Ditsy Dot watched me tuck into it. I remember I was sneezing violently and breaking out into a huge sweat, with beads of perspiration pouring down my face like raindrops because of the hot chili in the cake. My mouth was on fire and burning horrendously. I had to rush to the bathroom and hurl up the cake for some relief, and surreptitiously return from the bathroom and dutifully act on my mother's bidding by telling Ditsy Dot how incredibly delicious her cake actually was. "I added more cinnamon," she told me proudly, "to enhance the chocolate flavour." I remember thinking, "Ditsy Dot, you may as well have added an atomic bomb to that cake, because my word, that was one heck of a hot explosion in my mouth, and not the good kind either." My mother strictly forbade me to tell Ditsy Dot about her cookery debacle. "Now, dear, you must always be gracious. It's very sweet of Mrs. Dickens to make you a cake, so you must never mention the jalapeno pepper gaff, because that would almost certainly hurt her feelings, and you don't want to do that, do you?" The way my mother talked, I was beginning to believe that all adults were mentally tenuous, feeble, and fragile. So much so that you could not say how it was, because they would be so easily offended and aggrieved and disgruntled. I remembered thinking it was way too convoluted to be an adult, and I fancied myself like Peter Pan, never growing up, and my friends wholeheartedly agreed with me. "I agree," said Eloise. "I cannot understand grown-ups, one little bit. My mother got so upset because the neighbour's roses were bigger than hers. I promise you she actually started crying about it, she was so overwrought. I almost had to console her. Can you believe the nerve of it? She actually asked me to go around to the neighbour's house to offer to take Tigger, her dog, for a walk, and then to surreptitiously sneak into the backyard, pretending that I was looking for a stray tennis ball that I'd thrown for Tigger, that had accidentally ended up in her yard shed. I was to snoop around and see what rose food she was actually using. She stressed to me that it was paramount, that I must not under any circumstances ever forget the name and the brand of the rose food in question, because it was of the utmost importance. "That's where adults are completely crazy," said Colin. "Why didn't she just say, 'Your roses are so lovely and big, Mrs. Saunders. May I ask you what rose food you used?' Is it that difficult?" "Exactly my point," I said. "I told you, adults are really strange." "The strangest of all being Ditsy Dot," laughed Colin. "Remember when she forgot you were a boy and baked you a baby Barbie doll cake with jalapeno pepper?" he hooted. "I'd rather not remember that event," I said. "I still remember how badly my mouth burnt from all that hot pepper." It was indeed true. Our street did have its fair share of oddballs, but Ditsy Dot was quite literally the cream of the crop. Ditsy Dot was sometimes so dithery that she was often seen wearing her own brassiere over her dress, and she would sometimes wear the oddest of clothes combinations together, not taking into account style, size, colour, length, or even weather conditions into consideration. I have actually seen her wearing a kid's school blazer over a man's shirt, with a long flowing skirt 5 sizes too big for her, which is why it was hardly a wonder that she was often regarded as the bad lady. Another thing about Ditsy Dot is that she was a collector of absolutely everything she could get her hands on. I would see her going to the local woods, coming back with an old shopping trolley loaded with sticks, pine cones, and even pebbles. I would ask her what she was intending to use all those items of nature for, and she really appeared gormless and bemused, and proceeded to tell me that she had collected them because they were rather nice. I mean, what does that have to do with purposeful intent? Another area Ditsy Dot loved to frequent was the local dumpster. Sometimes we would ride on our bicycles past the dumpster and wave at her and tinkle our bells, and she would look up at us with a toothless grin because she had misplaced her dentures that morning and was covered in head to toe with someone's leftover baked beans. It would seem that Ditsy Dot was intent on gathering people's disposed items as valuable collectibles. She would shake her head in horror and complain bitterly at the things she retrieved from the dumpster that people had so carelessly, nonchalantly thrown away, with so little regard for the apparent value of the item in question. I would watch her shake her brown head of curls despairingly, as if people's behaviour was a huge enigma to her. "What is wrong with people these days?" she said. "Look at this," she would say, retrieving an old gnarled material dog bed that was falling apart at the seams and stunk to high heaven of wet dog, and had clearly seen much better days. "Now who would throw something like this away?" she said. "It's still in perfect condition." I would watch her put it into her shopping cart in absolute horror. "Mrs. Dickens," I'd say, "you don't even have a dog." "Really, boy," she'd say, "I don't see what that's got to do with anything." "Well," I explained, "of what use is it to you if you don't have a dog to sleep in it?" "Do they not teach you anything in school these days, boy?" she would say to me. Another time she pulled out a very dirty old plastic kid's potty from the dumpster and thought it was such a great mixing bowl, and it took me a long time to explain to her that it wouldn't be very sanitary to use for her cooking. I was dreading the prospect of my next birthday cake I'd be forced to eat by my incessant mother that had been sloppily mixed in an old kid's dirty potty before being presented to me. Such a horrifying thought was making me nauseous and desirous to throw up. Sometimes when Ditsy Dot was out shopping in the supermarket, passing shoppers would surreptitiously put money in her hands because they thought she was a vagrant, when in reality she never had a money issue one day in her life. She would say to us that she was so blessed because perfect strangers would simply just give her cash randomly. "I'm a money cow," she would tell me proudly. "People give me money out of the blue for no reason at all." One day when I was playing in the backyard with my two friends, we decided to climb the old oak tree that overlooked Ditsy Dot's home. We loved spying on her because she did the most peculiar congenial things that always made us crack up with laughter. My father had given me a pair of binoculars for the purposes of bird watching, but we had quickly learnt that scrutinising Ditsy Dot through our binoculars was infinitely more interesting and preferable than watching the beautiful birds in our garden, because she was always doing the craziest, most wacko things. "What's she doing now?" asked Eloise again. "Don't tell me she's eating cat biscuits again. I think she thinks they're pretzels." I remember she came over to our house once and ate Purdy's biscuits. When she came over for tea, she picked them up off the floor and ate them in front of my mum and I, and swore that they were the best snack she'd ever eaten. She even made a mental note of the fish flavour. Mackerel, I think it was. I precariously balanced my body on the tree branch and focused my binoculars on Ditsy Dot's kitchen, and I nearly dropped the binoculars in sheer shock. "What is it?" asked Eloise. "You've gone as white as a sheet." "What's Ditsy Dot doing now?" she asked. "We have a very big problem," I said to my friends. "A very big problem indeed." "What kind of problem?" asked Eloise, looking mystified. "We have an ape problem," I said. "I don't know how else to tell you, but it appears that Ditsy Dot has only gone and kidnapped a baby ape from the local zoo." "But how could she do that?" asked Eloise in horror. "How is that even physically possible? No one goes to the zoo and surreptitiously nicks an ape. You'd never get away with it. Someone would spot you." "Well, Ditsy Dot has," I said. "She's feeding the baby ape formula in a bottle in a high chair in the kitchen, and I'm not kidding you either. Look if you don't believe me," I said, handing the binoculars to my friends. "Golly gumdrops, he's right," said Eloise, looking through the binoculars in horror once she had squirreled her way up the tree. "What beats me is surely the zoo would have noticed it had gone missing." "Look," I said, "we need to handle this situation with kid gloves. You know how difficult Ditsy Dot can be. In the morning I'll have a solution to our problem. I can promise you that." And so it was that very evening I was sitting at dinner, playing with my roast potatoes, with my knife and fork, and my mother asked me why I was not hungry and why I appeared to be playing with my food. "You're not coming down with something, are you, dear?" she asked me, looking worried, running her hand over my forehead. "It would seem your temperature's quite normal." "I was just wondering, Mum, if it's all right for a human to raise an ape in America." I watched my father nearly choking on his potatoes in absolute horror. "Sonny boy," he said, Don't you get any ideas in that funny head of yours. I draw the line at owning an exotic pet, and owning an ape is crossing the line far too far, even for me." "Your father's right, dear," said my mother. "Getting an ape would not be appropriate. Besides, when they do get older, they're very mischievous. On a finer point, I doubt you can even own such an exotic pet here in North America. They're not an indigenous species, you see, to our part of the world, which definitely increases the likelihood that you'll be unlikely to be able to own one or rear one yourself. I know you'd like a brother and sister, but you know our situation. What if someone stole an ape from the zoo? What then?" I asked. My father looked incredibly alarmed. "Don't even think about it, sonny boy. An ape stolen from a zoo goes right back to its mother where it rightly belongs. So don't you even think about it, or I'll come after you like a steam train, sonny boy." "Thanks, Dad," I said. "You've just answered my question." The following morning I told my friends that we had to confront Ditsy Dot head on about the ape that she had stolen, because she needed to return it to the mother immediately, and it was as straightforward as that, and we needed to return it to the zoo from whence it actually came. Moving forward, as you can imagine, confronting Ditsy Dot about the little ape was not an easy discussion to have, but finally she did admit that she had found the ape in the woods when she was gathering pine cones. "I thought I'd give him a ride in my cart," she said, "when I found him in the nest. But when I got home I realised he was still sitting in the cart, and that I'd brought him back with me by mistake. So I had been taking care of him ever since with formula, and he's very happy, I promise you." "You got this ape from the woods?" I asked in shock. "You didn't steal it from the zoo?" "No, it's from the woods," she insisted. "How would I be able to take a zoo ape? You can't even reach them in their glass cages." I examined the baby ape very closely, taking her into my arms. I've never been keen on babies before, but this baby was the exception to that rule. She was the sweetest, most adorable, affectionate, lovable and funny baby that I've ever seen in my entire life. It was the size of a 1-year-old baby, but this creature was much younger than that. It was much more alert and brighter than a human baby, with these very big, brown, interested eyes that would follow you everywhere with an inquisitive interest and intrigue. It appeared unusually bright and sharp and clever for its age, and unlike a human baby, it didn't howl or cry at all. It just seemed to make a very cute little chattering sound. I noticed that the pinkish creature was also quite human-like in appearance, much more so than actually ape, which did leave me wondering what this curious ape-like creature was, with only a little scattering of hair over its body. It kept reaching out to play with my hair and tugging it with its little hand, and when I reacted with a "ouch," it would chuckle away happily to itself. "Mrs. Dickens," I said, "if you really did get this baby ape from the woods, we really are going to need to return it to its mother. You have unintentionally embezzled a baby ape, and it is morally reprehensible and very wrong. If this were a human child, you would be in very serious grave trouble with the police. You would have already been arrested, and your face would be splashed all over the papers, and everybody would be talking about you in town. Imagine what the poor mother is feeling without her baby. I know for an 11-year-old I was laying it on very thick, but I really wanted Ditsy Dot to understand the gravity of this very serious situation." Ditsy Dot's innocent brown eyes flooded with tears. "I didn't mean to take the baby," she repeated. "I was just giving him a ride in the shopping cart, and I forgot he was still in there when I got home." "I know all that," I said, trying to reassure her. "Mrs. Dickens, try and remember whereabouts in the woods you found the baby," I urged her. "We really need to return it to the mother." "It was under the very old oak tree on the right side of the forest overlooking the stream. I found it in a nest there," she said, it sounding much more coherent and compos mentis than she had for a very long time. I think my strong words had quite literally shaken her out of her dithery state, and she was suddenly beginning to comprehend the frivolity of what she'd actually done. Suddenly I was feeling incredibly grown up and important, and I realised that the job I was doing today was the most salient job of my entire life. I was returning a baby to its mother, and it doesn't get more important than that. But I was baffled and very confused as to how it was possible or even plausible that a little ape-like being was actually living in the woods and being raised by a mother in North America of all places. Ditsy Dot had finally satisfied me that she had indeed acquired the baby in the woods, and I had no choice in the circumstances but to believe her and to take her solemn word for it. Besides crazy she may be, but she most certainly was not a liar, and was usually as open as a book, unlike the other adults that I knew. Luckily I was able to recover my old stroller from the back of our garage, which my mother had never ever thrown away, in the vain hope that she'd fall pregnant again. I gather it was a miracle that she had fallen pregnant with me in the very first place, as the doctors had assured her that she was unlikely that she'd ever have children again. So my mother was amazed when I came along. My mother had unrelentingly hung on to the fleeting, yearnful hope that one day a miracle of nature would abound, and she would be blessed with a baby girl. But to date that long-hoped-for voracious miracle had all but eluded her. So there we were, all three of us kids, venturing towards the woods to return the baby ape. The beautiful ape-like humanoid was being wheeled along in the stroller like a regular child, and she appeared to be enjoying the ride, as her cute little face was making the sweetest expressions, and her bright brown inquisitive eyes were assimilating everything and missing nothing. She kept making the cutest chattering sounds, and appeared to be really enjoying her little adventure. "She is the most beautiful baby I've ever seen," said Eloise. "I so wish we could keep her. She's just so cute." "Well, we can't, Eloise," I snapped. "I wish you would stop acting all grown up and important just because we're delivering an ape to its mother. It's all gone to your head, I think," said Eloise. "I liked you better when you wanted to be Peter Pan. Then you were really like a child." "Today, Eloise," I told her, "is my day to be a man. We have a very important job to do." I truly had no idea what to expect as we entered the woods. I knew we could not leave the baby without ensuring that the mother returned to collect it. Otherwise it was truly abandoned. I would reluctantly then have to involve my parents as to what the next course of action should be. As it had only been 48 hours since Ditsy Dot had taken the baby from the woods, I was really praying with all my heart that mother and son would be finally reunited. The pine forest was very beautiful and smelt like Christmas. I always loved this place because it was such a tranquil haven and a glorious area to play around with my friends, especially when the sunny weather was way too hot on a summer's day. I always found the shade of the forest so cooling and refreshing, offering just enough light through the branches to allow the beams of sunlight to dapple the forest floor in a soft, pretty light. The forest was full of maples, red oaks, ash, spruce and pine trees, and it was always teeming with an abundance of wildlife, from white-tailed deer to squirrels and rabbits, and so it was not a surprise for us to uncover a very inquisitive squirrel tucking into an acorn and observing us with a very keen interest, as if to say, "What are you doing here?" The forest was filled with a chorus of pretty birdsong and warbles, and I could feel my heart fluttering with excitement. I just knew in my gut that something quite magnificent was about to transpire. I could sense it in every fibre of my being. "She's expecting us," said Eloise suddenly. "I feel it in my gut. She knows we're returning her baby. She's been expecting us for quite a while." Colin looked startled. "I can't believe you said that." "I've been thinking the very same thing," he said. "The thought just wafted in my head from nowhere. And I've never been much of a thinker. I usually just draw blanks, but I keep thinking she's expecting us." "I feel it too," I said. She must really be waiting for us." Suddenly we found the oak tree that Ditsy Dot had told us all about, and sure enough there was a nest there lying in between a pile of rocks, stacked up like a fire pit, creating a rustic-looking cot, in the woods, and placed in a very discreet area tucked away from inquisitive prying eyes. It was hard to believe that Ditsy Dot had even discovered it. The nest was lined with soft mosses and grasses, and I knew at once that this was the baby's little nursery, and I lifted up the baby and put it into the stone-like cot. "Now we need this to hide close by to make absolutely sure the mother returns to collect her baby," I told my friends. "Now hide. We haven't got much time to lose." All three of us proceeded to take cover behind the shelter of a very large grand oak tree, and then we saw her. She came dashing out of the shadows faster than a flash of greased lightning, and proceeded to grab her baby very quickly and fast, and hold her baby in her arms as if her very life depended on it. And she wore a jubilant, happy expression all over her face. I could feel tears welling and rising in my eyes, and even Eloise was crying. "I can't help myself," she admitted. "This is the most poignant reunion I've ever seen. The mother is deliriously happy, and so is the baby. Look, the baby's so delighted to see its mother. Look how happy it is. I can't believe this. This is so magical." But what was she, I wondered, marvelling the mother for a compelling moment, because I had no idea what kind of bipedal creature she actually was. The only way I can describe her to you is looking like she was part human and part ape, if that's at all possible. There was no doubt she was magnificent. I was marvelling her in the same way that I would admire a lion or a rhino, because that's how imposing and majestic and impressive she was. Even though I was very young at the time, I would guess she was at least over 8 foot tall. You see, my dad's over 6 foot, and this creature would have easily towered over him by at least 2 feet. I think she was between 700 and 800 pounds and about 4 foot wide. She was covered all over her body with long flowing hazel brown hair, and it was a little matted and tangled in parts, but that did not matter at all or make her any the less more awesome. I noticed she had very overlong arms that were so big she would possibly have no difficulty walking on all fours as on 2 feet. Her whole body was massively colossal and ripped with muscle in every single area. I think she could have easily made a bodybuilder look small in comparison to her. The shoulders on her body were quite literally huge and highly developed and very pronounced, reminding me of those swimmers that swim the butterfly stroke in the Olympic Games. I noticed her head was shaped like a cone, and she virtually had no neck. I was observing her through my binoculars behind the tree in anticipation of getting a rarely brilliant view of her, and my sharp lens definition did not disappoint. Her face was both gentle and kind and sweet, and so was that of her baby. I could definitely see the resemblance, and there was no doubt in my mind that the baby was most assuredly hers, although her full dangling, hair-covered breasts announced her motherhood only too clearly. I noticed she had yellow-brown deep-set eyes, a furrowed brow ridge, and a very large flat nose, and a slender mouth. We stood in awful admiration as we observed her cradle her baby, tuck it under her arms, and then move away so incredibly fast. It was a powerfully stirring and effacious moment for all three of us. 1 minute she was there, and then she was gone as fast as lightning. She moved with elegance, grace, and speed, just like that of a cheetah, and you could have been forgiven for saying, "Did I really actually just see that?" Years after this extraordinary, evocative, pivotal event in my young, wonderful life, I look back on this moment in time with such fond, magical memories, as seeing that mother reunited with her baby had to be the most breathtaking, moving thing that I have ever seen in my entire life. I know that there is no conceivable possible way that anybody else on this earth but Ditsy Dot herself could have found something like that baby ape in its nest on the forest floor. She always found things that other people could never find, like she found Mrs. Salmon's diamond ring that had been missing for 5 long years, and Mr. Piper's old pipe that had gone missing for 15. My mother did give birth to a baby 2 years after this incredible event, and the doctors described my sister Caroline as yet another extraordinary miracle, born from a woman who was considered unable to have children. So miracles do exist in the most unlikely of places. Sometimes so never overlook the possibility of attaining a miracle yourself, because believe me, they will and do always happen. Ditsy Dot sadly died about 10 years ago, but I always think of her standing in the dumpster covered in baked beans, getting excited about someone's cast-offs. I remember her with such great warmth and thankfulness of heart because of my encounter with that hairy humanoid. I now know that the creature I encountered in the woods all those years ago was a Bigfoot, and I feel so privileged to have physically seen such an extraordinary creature. If it hadn't been for the forgetful, innocent and whimsical charms of Ditsy Dot, that encounter would have never been conceivably possible. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Mark, and my Bigfoot encounter happened almost 10 years ago in 2010. The story begins when my mother was talking to her stepsister on the phone. I was 18 at the time, and her stepsister called Tina told her that the family was going abroad for a 4-week vacation to England, Ireland and Scotland. They were so very excited, but didn't want to board their very large dogs and their single cat while they were away. But the last time they'd hired a sitter to look after their animals, he had let them down atrociously, and they had returned home early from the vacation. I gather he'd been using drugs and was high as a kite most of the time and had done a very poor job in taking care of their animals. I rarely checked all his background stuff, said Tina, and no one had a bad thing to say about the young man. And look how that turned out. I don't know if I can put my trust in another sitter. I really don't know what I'm going to do. My mother suddenly had a splendid idea. Mark's available for 4 weeks, she said. He'll take care of your animals. Besides, I'm sure a little fresh country air would do him the world of good. Mark, cried my Aunt Tina in delight. Oh, that would be absolutely fabulous. But do you think he'd be up to it? It's pretty remote out here. The nearest town is only an hour's drive away. For a young man, that could be tediously dull. Not for Mark, said my mother. He loves the great outdoors and enjoys his own company. So it was all arranged. I was to go and stay at my step-aunt's house, and believe it or not, I was actually rather excited. I loved life in New York, but it really lacked the space and the openness of the countryside, so I was really looking forward to a change of scene. I'd never been to my step-aunt's house before, so I had no idea what to expect. I had been instructed that all the keys for the house were under a large blue flower pot in the entrance to the property. I found myself driving down this remote dirt back road that looked like it had once been a logger's road. Both sides of the road were lined with large oak trees that swept back into the surrounding valley for miles, forming seemingly vast areas of natural forest. I finally found the shabby-looking pole gate that led up to another dirt road to a very large wooden cabin. The cabin was a Scandinavian-style full-log home with a 10-foot-high log wall. It was really quite spacious and very pretty, which surprised me, because I'd never imagined Aunt Tina to have much style, but this log home was utterly enchanting. I could hear excited barking as I opened the front door and was greeted by 2 giant Irish wolfhounds and 3 very affectionate cats. I thought she only had 1, but it appeared to be 3, and they were very friendly to me. Inside the cabin was even more luxurious than the outside. The place was tidy, spacious, and clearly designed for comfort, but in a very stylish way, which meant there was very comfortable sofas strewn around the house that were so pleasing to the body as any bed would be. I could see Aunt Tina had prepared the fireplaces for me and kept the fridge and freezers stuffed and stocked with food and ready-prepared meals that she had labelled for me fastidiously. This really was going to be more like a holiday retreat than a chore, I thought excitedly. I lit the fire as it was starting to get quite chilly outside. I fed the dogs and cats and sat down to watch some television. Before I knew it, I'd fallen fast asleep. I was soon to learn that these sofas were almost more comfortable than a bed. I woke up to 2 Irish wolfhounds growling at the front door in such a way that I began to wonder that if someone was out there. I turned off the TV and listened, but I heard nothing. Then I realized there definitely was someone outside because I could suddenly hear a crunching of heavy footsteps on the gravel. I suddenly felt quite anxious and grabbed the firearm that was hanging on the rack close to the door. Who would be out here at this time of the night? Aunt Tina had not told me of any potential visitors, so I was not expecting anyone. Suddenly I heard a very loud slapping sound on the side of the cabin, almost as if someone was deliberately hitting the wooden beams of the cabin with a very large, heavy pole. The dogs went ballistic, and their barks were deafening, and the cats all scrambled under the furniture, hiding away in terror. If this was how the animals were behaving, the disturbances on this night were unusual for them. Should I be worried, I wondered? Should I call the police or a neighbour, or should I just wait and see if everything calmed down? And I'm glad to say that it actually did. The next few days that followed were incredibly beautiful, and the nights that followed were peaceful and serene, and I was beginning to forget about the intruder on my first night. But then the same disturbances began all over again, but this time the noises were thunderously loud, as whatever it was relentlessly banging the house like a heavy drum, as if it was trying to get my attention. I stumbled out the front door, clutching the rifle very tightly with both the 2 wolfhounds running behind me. They were looking up at the cabin and barking hysterically. I could smell this foul skunk-like odour in the air, and as I looked up at the cabin roof, I saw the silhouette of the most monstrous bipedal creature looking directly down at me. Bear in mind I'm a New Yorker, and I'm obliviously unaware of cryptid-like creatures like Bigfoot. Of course I have heard about those things before, but the notion of such a creature actually existing was preposterous in my mind's eye. I actually believed people who believed in such things were naive and gullible. As I gazed up at the rooftop, I knew I was facing a very dangerous, colossal creature, and whatever it was, I had no idea. I just stared up at it in stupefied silence, hardly daring to believe what I was actually seeing. This thing was colossal, much bigger and more frightening than a grizzly, and its body was covered with dark, short hair. What I noticed about this creature was the weird cone-shaped head that flowed down seamlessly to a huge pair of shoulders, bypassing any need for a neck. The upper torso of this thing reminded me of the Incredible Hulk. It was so monstrously big that it made the hips and legs look thin by comparison, yet in reality every appendage of this gargantuan beast was monstrously big. I'm not good at estimating weights and heights as a general rule. However, I think I can safely say this thing weighed 1,000 pounds and was at least 10 foot tall. The creature stared at me with a very large primate-looking face, with a very prominent brow ridge, flat nose and a thin mouth, but it was those eyes, so deep-set and brown, but had a very definite red eye shine that put the fear of God into every cell of my body. The eyes were as round as saucers, and truly they glowed in a red traffic-light colour. It felt like they penetrated me like a red laser light. I watched the creature pounding the cabin with the large timber pole he was carrying in his long arms. It was like he wanted me to see what he was actually doing. What on earth was he trying to do, I wondered? Why was he beating the cabin like this? If he was trying to scare me, it was working because I was terrified. I was a city boy and stuff like this I knew nothing about. It was all beyond me. I aimed the rifle at the creature, not knowing what else to do, and when he saw me do this, he let out the most awful, frightful scream, and it sounded almost feminine, almost like a female being murdered. It was so terrifying that even the dogs yelped in terror and scuttled back into the cabin, looking for somewhere to hide. I watched the creature jumping off the side of the house, about a 14-foot drop, I kid you not, and the creature landed on his feet that appeared to be very padded, with the agility of a domestic cat. And then he literally tottered away on his padded feet across the ground with the speed and grace of a cheetah, and then he was gone from my sight. I stood there for a long moment in total silence and absolute awe, trying to mentally comprehend and make sense of everything that had just transpired, and then I went back indoors and bolted every single door and window, and I allowed the dogs to pee on newspaper because I was not coming out of that cabin until the morning. The next day I examined the area outside where the creature had scuttled away, and there was an area beyond the gravel where the ground was actually wet, and I discovered 3 very distinct footprints that measured at least 17 inches in the ground. Now, believe me, that's big. Suddenly I noticed a young woman coming up the drive. In truth, I was relieved to see someone human after everything that had occurred the previous night. She had brown hair tied back in a ponytail and was wearing jeans, boots and a white blouse. "Hello," she said, reaching for my hand. "My name is Sue. I'm your closest neighbour. Tina told me you were looking after the animals while she's away. I know this is going to sound strange, but I wondered if you've been experiencing any strange activity, such as banging sounds at night on your cabin." "How do you know about that?" I asked. "Because something weird's been going on over the last 3 days. 3 of the neighbours have been experiencing these angry drumming sounds on their houses. I just wondered if you got to see anything. Everyone was too afraid to go outside their houses to see what was going on, but something was on their roofs, banging away very violently." "I saw it," I said to Sue, and I proceeded to tell her about what had happened and how I had seen this massive creature on my roof hitting the cabin like a drum. "You do know what you saw," said Sue. "I believe you saw a Bigfoot." "But are those things actually real?" I asked. "You tell me," she said. "You're the one that actually saw it." "What does he want?" I asked. "Good question," said Sue. "Why, after all these years, without ever seeing sight or sound of these things, is this creature very suddenly trying to scare us all half to death? And not just you, all 3 of the neighbours." "Have you ever seen one?" I asked. "No, never. But I have heard their whoops and owl calls, so I know they're out there. People go looking for these things, you know, but they tend to be so elusive and private. There are occasional sightings, but some people believe they're bogus or misidentified." "And you?" I asked. "Do you believe these sightings are bogus?" "If I did then, I don't now. I know there's a huge creature on our roof last night banging away, and you got to see a Bigfoot, so it's clearly what's going on. A Bigfoot has been terrorizing not only you, but 3 of the other neighbors too. Where do you think they actually live? I asked. Look around you, laughed Sue. There are forests absolutely everywhere, abundant wildlife, loads of water sources. What is there not to like for a Bigfoot here? They could live anywhere around here, especially in those forests. Has there been any changes around here recently? I asked suddenly. I have heard that animals don't like sudden change. Oh my word, gasped Sue. You could be onto something there. All this commotion started after my dad started logging in that forest over there, she said, pointing in a southerly direction. It could be their habitat. I suggest maybe it's a spot where they live and they're expressing their anger. Excuse me, said Sue. I've just had an idea. I'm going to phone the logging team and find out if they've been experiencing any abuse from this creature. She dialed a number on her mobile phone, and I watched her pacing up and down the drive very nervously. But where did they go? I heard her say. When did this happen? What did you say? Thanks, Rolf. Speak to you later. Sue looked at me, and her face went as white as a sheet. The loggers have all bailed, she said. They're simply refusing to work, because they've been terrified. Something's been watching them and has been throwing big boulders at them while they've been logging. They've been hearing growling and roaring sounds in the forest and seen the shadow of a giant-like creature staring at them through the trees, and he's hostile, aggressive, and relentless in his actions. And apparently the forest stinks because of this thing. It must be the Bigfoot I saw, I said. He was colossal. Well, we're all in danger if something's not done about this. I'll speak to my dad. The next day I learnt from Sue that they were no longer going to log that particular area, and her father had called a halt to the activity and the logging because he didn't want this creature to harm anyone, and he didn't want to go after the thing either with all guns blazing. We need to leave those things well alone, he'd said. The moment the logging stopped, so did the banging on all our homes, and everything went back to normal, and I was able to enjoy the rest of my stay at my aunt's cabin. I did go with Sue to see the woods where the loggers experienced the Bigfoot activity, and they were beautiful and teeming with wildlife, and there was a sparkling spring running through the whole area. While we were there, the forest went incredibly quiet, and we did sense eyes on us, so we both left the place as fast as we could, and have never been back. I returned to New York and continued my life, but something in me has changed dramatically. I used to be so set in my opinions about things, and reluctant to consider other possibilities, but now I'm much more open to things. I also believe it's made me a much nicer person, more sensitive to the feelings of others, and I like myself more these days. What some people might pooh-pooh as impossible, I will stop and consider, because who knows, it could and it just might be true. I like the fact that I don't have to close the door on an idea because of a limited mindset and a closed belief system. I know that if Bigfoot is out there, then there may be other cryptid creatures like him too. It's got me wondering about legends of old when strange creatures were described and accounted for in the past. Could they be real too? Anything is possible to me now, and for me the world has become a much more exciting and mysterious place. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I've never ever told my Bigfoot story to anyone before, for the fear of being ridiculed and disbelieved, but in an anonymous forum like yours, I'm more than delighted to share my story with you and your listeners. It all began in the early 80s when my husband and I moved into a small little country bungalow in rural Mississippi that had been given to us as a very generous wedding present from my husband's grandmother. I was 26 at the time and my husband Freddie was 23, and we were so excited about settling down to a brand new life in the countryside. I was going to raise chickens and keep a couple of pigs in our backyard, while my husband was taking on a local job in the nearby town. We lived on the right-hand side of a narrow, windy dirt road, where all the quaint, whimsical-looking cottage-style homes were all painted in bright yellows, blues, greens and terracottas, so typical of the 80s era. The houses were built really quite close to each other, so on either side of our house we had relatively close neighbours that all possessed their own fenced-in yards that overlooked beautiful emerald green mountainous valleys and vast areas of enchanting, majestic trees that stretched out into magnificent forest. For a very naive young married couple, we were in our element, delighting in the ravishing views that we embraced every single morning when we woke up. I would have to pinch myself every single day and say, "Is this really all mine?" I'd grown up in a very bustling city with hectic time schedules, deadlines, and rushing around from 9 to 5 every single day. It was so hard to believe that I was embracing a brand new lifestyle without being governed and dictated to by my alarm clock blaring at 5 o'clock every single morning. We settled into our country abode very happily. I busied myself hanging curtains and choosing bright, bold paint colours for all the bedrooms, as well as attractive, sumptuous, striking designer materials for sofa covers and dining room chairs. I was also planting a vegetable patch in the backyard and trying my hand at growing cucumbers, lettuce, tomatoes, pumpkins and marrows for the very first time in my life, and I was so enthusiastic about this yard prospect, obliviously unaware of the challenges I was going to face in my yard. I was also creating a quaint little terraced area for colourful flower beds at the entrance area of my property. I was in unparalleled domestic bliss, creating a dreamy, cosy home for my husband and I to settle down in, and things were going brilliantly well for us. That was until one day a couple of university students moved into the house next door, and that was when all hell broke loose. It all began when at about midnight every single night we would be awoken to the terrible sound of booming heavy metal music, drumming and blaring angrily through the night sky, and it was so deafening I thought my eardrums would actually burst. I could not imagine who could possibly enjoy such dreadful, eruptive, explosive acid rock, and the sound was coming from our new next-door neighbour. He clearly had a very sophisticated sound system that he wasn't afraid of using on the highest volumes at the most ungodly hours in the late night and early morning. In unison with these nightly tirades of ear-splitting, blasting music from our neighbour's home, we also heard these menacing screams at night that came from the forest that seemed to coincide whenever the neighbour was playing that heavy metal music. The sound was so disturbingly haunting, like a woman being murdered, so they really made me feel precariously apprehensive and afraid. I did even begin to wonder if our forest was in fact haunted. I was very disturbed, unsettled and afraid, because like most people I enjoyed a good night's sleep. But my husband assured me it was possibly just a once-off, and the teenagers next door were having a sleepover, and it was very unlikely to happen again. But he was proved very wrong, much to my disappointment and inevitable regret. The music would blare loudly for several nights a week, and it was always the same awful heavy metal drumming sound that could bring on a horrendous migraine headache if you weren't careful, and it set my nerves on edge because it was extremely head-banging. That's the only way I can describe it. One day I decided to take matters into my own hands and try the gentle neighbourly approach, as I had to live next door to these people, and I didn't want to make staunch enemies out of them. I had heard nasty stories before about spiteful neighbours turning on each other, so invariably living next door to my greatest enemy was not my idea of a peaceful, stress-free life in the country, and I wanted to avoid it at every cost. I knocked on the door of the neighbour's bungalow, and a pretty fair-skinned 18-year-old girl opened the door to me. Her feminine feet were adorned with pink fluffy slippers, and she was wearing a pair of pale green pinstripe pyjamas at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I noticed that her long mane of hazel-brown curls was flattened on one side, as if she'd just climbed out of bed to answer the door only a second ago. "Sorry to wake you," I said. "I can see that you've just been sleeping." She wiped the sleep from her chestnut-brown eyes, and then yawned. "Is it that obvious?" she said, beckoning me in. "Come in," she said, guiding me into a very messy living-room area that distinctly smelt of the lingering afterglow of weed and cigarette smoke. The place was an absolute pigsty, because there were empty beer cans strewn absolutely everywhere, ashtrays filled with cigarette butts, bottles of cheap red wine, and empty pizza boxes littering the room. In the far corner I detected a very impressive sound system that looked like it belonged to a radio studio rather than a small cottage. It looked like it was state-of-the-art equipment for the 1980s, and it hadn't come cheap, I could see that. The girl moved the pizza boxes on the couch and proceeded to place them into a black bin liner. She beckoned for me to sit down. "Sorry about the mess," she exclaimed. "My boyfriend and I are pretty untidy. "You must be our neighbour. I've been meaning to come around and introduce myself. I'm Purdy." "I'm Caroline," I told her, "although you can call me Carol for short." "Look," I said, "I really don't want to beat around the bush, nor do I want to be rude, but the music you're playing late at night is keeping me wide awake and stopping me from getting any sleep." "Tell me about it," she laughed. "Why do you think I'm still in my pyjamas? Johnny just loves heavy metal, and he can't get enough of it. He suffers from dreadful insomnia, so he plays the music all night until all the hours of the morning, and I don't get a wink of sleep either. It's beginning to drive me crazy." "Can you not speak to him about it?" I asked. "I've tried," she said, "but believe me, it's no use. He won't listen, because he's addicted to the stuff, and he's as stubborn as hell. His affluent parents are absolutely loaded, and they brought him this place out in the sticks because they wanted him out of their hair. They couldn't stand his music either. It's an acquired taste, isn't it?" "You could say that," I said. "The problem is that really it's not fair on any of the neighbours. You could actually describe it as noise pollution and a public nuisance, if I'm being completely blunt." "Oh, I agree," said Purdy. "We've had complaints from some of the neighbours already who are also not happy about the noises at night. One of them went as far as to call the police, but after the police officer came around and asked Johnny to tone things down, no sooner had the officer left, it was not long before Johnny was up to his old tricks again. The music has a bizarre kind of mesmeric hold over him, if you know what I mean. It's like an addiction, I think." "Well, something needs to be done about it," I said, "because it cannot go on. It's driving me absolutely insane, and the neighbours too. The trouble is your sound system belongs in a soccer stadium, not a cottage like this, because the music can be heard from miles away. Because a sound like this, it travels far, believe me." "Look, I'll talk to him," said the girl, trying to console me. "Oh, here he is," she said. "Speak of the devil. Johnny, meet our neighbour, Carol, from next door." Johnny looked at me through very sleepy blue eyes and rubbed his hands through his ruffled locks of black hair, and then grunted something that was barely audible, but I think it was, "Hi." "Hi," I said. Johnny rummaged through the pizza boxes until he found an old leftover pizza slice in the box, which he proceeded to eat hungrily. "I'm famished," he said. "Oh, this tastes good." "Johnny, Caroline would like you to tone down your music, because she says she cannot sleep at night," said Purdy. "That's what they all say," laughed Johnny. "But you'll get used to it after a while. It's good stuff, you know, quality music. You can't beat it. It beats all the crap they have on the radio these days." "Look," I said, "you've been getting complaints from your other neighbours as well, and the police were even called, so I think I can safely say that your music is too raucously loud, and it isn't fair on any of us. We're all trying to get some sleep." "All right, fair enough. I'll turn down the volume," he said, looking bashful. I walked away from the neighbour's house, wondering if my visit had made any difference at all, and whether Johnny would finally turn down his music. Somehow I had this horrible feeling in my gut that these neighbours of mine were not going to be easy to deal with. I did wonder whether Purdy was just humouring me to appease me, and was she really as into heavy music as much as Johnny was, I wondered. I thought it was possible, but I couldn't be entirely sure. Maybe she genuinely hated that blustering, obnoxious music as much as I did, and hopefully she could get through to that obstinate boyfriend of hers that the heavy metal was an acquired taste. Why could they not enjoy something civilised like the Carpenters or the Bee Gees or Boy George, I wondered. The next few nights that followed, the music did seem to settle down a great deal, but then once again the volume was revived, and I was regretfully awakened all over again to that horrendous, rambunctious heavy metal that was beginning to drive me totally insane. In a state of absolute exhausted frustration, I moaned and prized myself out of my cosy duvet. I was surprised to see what a heavy sleeper Freddie was, as he hadn't awoken by the massive fulminating noises coming from the neighbour's house. If that heavy metal wasn't bad enough, it was made 1,000 times worse by the loud clanging, banging and rattling sound that Johnny was making outside his own house. Was he completely tone-deaf, I wondered in horror. It appeared that he had developed an interest in banging everything in time to his music, as if our neighbourhood had suddenly become a massive live concert for him. No wonder his parents paid him to move away, I thought. Suddenly I heard these terrifying loud screams of a woman in very serious distress, a sound I'd heard increasingly frequently every time Johnny appeared to play his music. It truly sounded like a woman being assaulted or even murdered. I had told my husband that the local woods were haunted, and judging by the wailing sounds, I was almost certain I was right. I'd never believed in the supernatural before, but those wails made my blood turn cold and sent shivers of fear down my spine. When Freddie had heard the ominous wails before, he too was convinced the sound was supernatural and not of this world. "Remind me never to go into those woods at night," he said to me. "Something is not right there. Those wails are haunting." I thought moving into the country would be peaceful for us, but the noise pollution was 1,000 times worse than the bustle of the big city. The next morning I opened the door, in my amazement, to our neighbour Purdy, who appeared to be crying. She was wearing her pyjamas, and there were black rings of exhaustion around her pretty brown eyes. "Are you all right?" I asked, ushering her hurriedly into my kitchen and putting the kettle on to make her a hot cup of warm sweet tea. By the looks of her pale face, she was going to need it. "You're trembling," I said. "What's the matter?" "Was it you last night, banging and slapping our house with a metal pole? It was the most frightfully terrifying noise I've ever heard in my life." "Well," I said, "wasn't Johnny playing that blasting music last night? And I noticed he did raise the volume again. And yes, I did hear the dreadful rattling and banging coming from outside, but I did think it was Johnny making all that brazen commotion. In truth, I thought he was creating an alfresco live band outside. It certainly wasn't me, I assure you." "Well, it was someone," said Purdy. "If it wasn't you, then who was it? It scared me half to death. It sounded like someone or something monstrously colossal was on our roof and banging our gutters and drains, and it was so terrifying we could hear these ponderous, heavy feet walking around on the roof. It was like something out of a horror movie. Even Johnny was freaked out by the pandemonium, but we were too afraid to go outside to see who or what it was." "I'm sure it was terrifying," I said sympathetically, handing Purdy the cup of warm tea, which she began to drink very gratefully. "It was horrendously loud," she said. "I think it was a retaliatory response from an enraged neighbour, and I was kind of hoping it was you." "Sorry," I said, "it wasn't, but maybe Johnny, if he stops playing his rowdy music, the neighbour who's trying to do this to scare you both will stop. I imagine he's just got so frustrated from the sounds at night, and he's possibly playing a tit-for-tat game with you both. But yes, I agree, he did go too far trying to scare you like that." "Who do you think it is?" asked Purdy. "Well, it could be that guy Matthew at number 21, because he has a very short fuse and he can be quite cranky and crotchety and a bit waspy from time to time, so I've been told, but I don't know him very well." "Yes, but getting on our roof and scaring us half to death is insane. Why didn't he just knock on our front door, for goodness sake, like any normal person would, and ask us to tone it down?" "Look," I said, "I'll talk to him for you if that helps at all, but please keep the volume down from now on. I don't want to see you getting into trouble from the police." Later that day I approached Matthew on Purdy's behalf and was surprised to find that he'd actually been out of the country for 2 long weeks and had only just returned home, and so he had no idea what I was actually talking about when I asked him whether he had anything to do with scaring the teenagers. "Of course not," he exclaimed. "I'd never try to frighten kids. That's crazy." The next night I was awoken to the same loud banging and rattling sounds all over again, but I noticed that Johnny's heavy metal was not blaring so loudly, but the commotion outside his house was almost worse than the music, and it went on and on and on. It was relentless, indignant, and very angry. I hurriedly put on my dressing gown because I wanted to see which one of our neighbours was trying to scare poor Purdy and Johnny. I now had them on my side. I knew that the heavy metal was a noise nuisance, but to go this far to scare the young teenagers in order to get revenge was not at all kind. I thought I would have it out with them, whoever they were, because scaring someone half to death was going way too far and was not fair, to say the very least. Armed with my flashlight, I made my way over to my neighbour's house, and in the light of a gloriously full, shimmering pearly moon and the twinkling light of the silvery stars, I succeeded in getting an excellent view of a very burly and strapping-looking fellow on our neighbour's roof, who appeared to be wearing a hefty bear-skinned coat and was hitting all the metal drain pipes with a very large piece of broken timber, with a banging, walloping, punnelling sound, which was too terrible for words. No wonder poor Purdy was terrified. This colossal, jumbo-sized man had his back turned away from me, and I could see he was a bodybuilder of some kind, because glancing at his back view briefly, it looked like he clearly defined muscles were moving between his shaggy coal-black coat that he was wearing, which was a little excessive and over the top, I thought, for a cool night like this. I mean, it wasn't even that cold. "Please come down," I shouted. "You're scaring everyone. What you're doing isn't nice. The teenagers in there are absolutely terrified." I allowed my torchlight to settle on the man on the roof, and then he turned around to directly look at me. I got the fright of my life, and my blood turned freezing cold. The man on the roof was no man at all, but was this huge humanoid ape-like creature, the likes of such that I have never ever seen before. I was so bowled over by what I was seeing, because the creature was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in my entire life, and his mere presence was causing me to shake and convulse like a jelly in an act of unadulterated terror. The creature looked at me with blazing, demonic red eyes that were incandescent with rage. This titanic-looking humanoid had very overlong arms and human-like hands, and his whole body literally ripped with muscle like an extreme bodybuilder who pumps iron and takes way too many steroids. Yet I could tell this critter was naturally lofty, majestic, powerful, and strong, without the help of any steroids, let me assure you. This thing, whatever in God's name it was, must have been 9 feet tall, 800 pounds, with the hugest shoulders and chest that I've ever seen. And the hair on his chest was less dense. I could see a very visible, impressive six-pack that most men would simply die for. It was the strange shape of the head that really got my attention, because it was a bullet shape, and it was elongated, and it had a long, leathery, grey-like face with a prominent brow ridge, which was very wrinkled and weathered, and deep-set eyes with a very big flat nose. When this humanoid ape creature saw me, he let out this monstrous, murderous scream that I had heard many times before, and falsely mistaken the sound as coming from a ghostly spectre in our forest. It caused my hair to stand on end in utter trepidation and terror. The creature started thrashing the drain pipe and throttling it even more violently as I was watching him, almost as if he was demonstrating to me how angry, resentful, infuriated he actually was. And in that moment I understood his vexation. He despised that heavy metal music even more than I did. Now that really was saying something. Inside my neighbour's house, Johnny, obliviously unaware as to what was going on, raised the volume of his heavy metal ever so suddenly. I think it may have been done deliberately to provoke the person that they believed was on the roof making such a commotion. Only the person that was on the roof was a hairy humanoid ape, who was far from happy with this gesture of defiant retaliation. Did Johnny have any idea who he was messing with? Because if he had a clue, he would never have been so blatantly bold and courageous as he was. As the music got louder, the humanoid ape's fury intensified, and he started to bang the pipes aggressively and violently, and the vibration was so loud that the nearest window just shattered and shredded into hundreds and thousands of little glassy pieces, and I could hear Purdy screaming inside the house and begging Johnny to call the police. "Johnny, call the police," she screamed over and over again. "The man on the roof is going completely insane." I stood there in silence with my jaw dropping to the ground, hardly daring to believe what I was actually seeing with my eyes. Suddenly I heard the footsteps of people from down the street rushing towards Johnny's house, clad in dressing gowns and slippers and armed with flashlights and rifles. They wanted to see what was going on and what this horrendous commotion was all about. The creature slunk away so very quickly and quietly and vanished before my sight. It was like he was there one minute and then he was gone the next. It was so incredibly fast. You could have been forgiven for thinking it was a ghost. Yet I knew what I saw was very real. "What's going on?" shouted one of the neighbours. "We heard the screams and the raucous commotion and the banging sounds from down the street. We are sick to death of all these noises at night, and they're getting worse, not better. And if those kids don't stop waking up the entire neighbourhood, we're going to report them to the police, because we've had just about as much as we can take." Johnny and Purdy came out of their houses looking as white as ghosts, only to find themselves facing a barrage of abuse from all the neighbours, who were laying into them thickly about all the noise pollution, the banging and the heavy metal sound effects. Purdy was in tears, and her boyfriend was very sullen and incredibly quiet. So I just brought them both into my kitchen and told the other neighbours to go, and not to worry because I would sort this problem out once and for all. "You better had, Carol, because if you don't, I'll get Sergeant Pepper to deal with them tomorrow," said one of our neighbours. As I prepared the hot chocolate for the two teenagers, I asked them what had happened, although I already knew, of course, but I wanted to hear their side of the story. "Well, Johnny's already been trying to play the music softly. I'm sure you must have noticed the huge effort he's been making to tone things down," said Purdy. "I know," I said, "and I definitely appreciate it. I've been finally having a decent night's sleep. But tell me, what exactly happened tonight?" "Well," said Purdy, "we heard that nasty, vindictive neighbour getting onto our roof again, and he was deliberately making these violent banging noises and was succeeding in scaring us half to death, which was really strange because we did try to keep the volume low. We could hear him thumping on the roof, and he sounded like this huge, colossal piece of concrete shuffling around." "So I suppose in retaliation you decided to turn up the volume," I said. "Precisely," said Purdy. "But it angered our neighbour all the more because he became incensed and kept banging on our gutters even louder, and the window in our bedroom just shattered." "It was not one of the neighbours banging your gutters. It was a huge creature," I said. "What do you mean, creature?" asked Purdy in surprise. "You're scaring me now." I know this is going to be hard to believe, but because I heard the noise, I did go outside to challenge the person that was scaring you. But the thing that I was challenging was not human. It was an animal of some kind. "What on earth do you mean, not human?" asked Johnny. "I don't understand." "I think your heavy metal has upset this creature, which was why he was banging on your home in the first place. Well, that's the impression it gave me anyway." "Wow," said Johnny. "Are you absolutely sure?" "I know what I saw," I confirmed, "and it definitely wasn't human." "What did it look like?" "Like a 9-foot human ape covered in hair, very strong, muscular, and exceedingly dangerous." "You are winding me up," laughed Johnny. "This is a joke, right?" "Am I laughing?" I asked. "I know what I saw, and I wouldn't lie to you about anything. I just think you both could be in very big danger if you continue playing that dreadful music. I think it physically is hurting that creature, because when you raised the volume, I noticed the creature went ballistic, but it also put its hands over its ears, as if the music was actually physically hurting him. It made him appear very incensed and distressed." "You think that creature actually lives in the forest out there?" asked Purdy. "Oh, I do," I said. "I'm sure of it. Did you hear the screams it was making?" "That screaming was the creature?" asked Purdy in amazement. "I've heard that screaming from the woods before. Johnny and I thought it was from a ghost. It sends shivers down your spine. It's so freaky. It sounds like it's supernatural, not natural." "Well, it's from the creature, I promise you." "What do you think the creature is?" asked Johnny. "I've no idea," I said. "Maybe we'll never know. But don't tell other people about this because they will not believe you, and they'll think you're half mad. I was almost wondering if I should tell you myself, because I know it sounds crazy, but I promise you that that is what I saw on your roof, and it slipped away very quickly after the whole neighbourhood was awakened. It just disappeared into the woods so fast I could hardly believe it." Fast forward a few weeks, and everything in our rural neighbourhood quieted down so, much to my delight and the huge relief of all the neighbours in our area. Johnny chose to stop playing his heavy metal, and then all the activity died down. It was very hard for my neighbours to believe my story of the humanoid ape, until one day Purdy and Johnny were driving home after visiting Johnny's parents, and as they were driving down our dirt road, they saw the humanoid ape for themselves, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was crossing their path. It was about 9 foot tall, 5 feet wide, and about 800 pounds. And the creature looked at them directly, in the eyes, and then quickly retreated into the forest. They could not believe what they had physically seen. As you can imagine, they were so excited to put a face to the creature that had hounded them when they had played their heavy metal music. All these years later, Johnny and Purdy finally got married, and I was asked to be their maid of honour at her wedding. They are now very special close friends of mine and still live next door to me all these years later. When we get together and commiserate, we always talk about the Bigfoot because we now know what the creature was that climbed onto their roof. We all believe that the poor creature could not abide the atrocious sound of heavy metal, and even Johnny today admits that his music was utterly horrendous, and that if he saw the Bigfoot today, he would definitely apologise for the commotion that he caused.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.